This is Mrs. Murdock, and this is a mini lecture on microevolution and macroevolution. So what I want to tell you is, first of all, microevolution are changes that occur to the individuals in a population that might alter their appearance and chemistry a little bit in small increments, but not enough to cause speciation. So all the things that Darwin talked about, natural selection, and the things that Hardy-Weinberg talked about in terms of changing the allele frequency of a population, that can cause small changes. And that's still called evolution. You still call that evolution. But you don't call it macroevolution, which is when you get a whole new species, unless it causes so much change that the two populations can no longer interbreed. That's the way we measure it. So microevolution are the small changes that might happen. Maybe feather colors change a little bit. Maybe you get some extra eye colors. Maybe you have slightly different body chemistry, but not enough to prevent two different populations from still successfully breeding and creating viable offspring. So speciation is defined, at least the biological definition of speciation, is when populations become different enough that they can no longer interbreed unless you get a new species that gets created. That's what speciation means. And that is really what macroevolution is. Micro meaning small, right? Macro meaning large, larger leaps. So macroevolution is defined as changes that occur that are enough to cause reproductive isolation. In other words, populations may have gotten separated and may have been exposed to selection pressures that were so different that when individuals of those populations came back together, they were no longer able to reproduce viable offspring together. That's the biological definition of species. And if that has happened, if you have a population of animals, for example, that get separated, either a giant river goes through them or a mountain rises up between them or something like that happens to separate the population, that's called geographic isolation. And usually that's what will cause macroevolution or speciation, because then on one side of the mountains, you might have very, very different conditions. The climate might be different. The vegetation and food might be different. Whereas on the other, maybe it will continue as usual, as what the original species was used to. But if that happens for long enough, the separated population might go through some very, very dramatic changes due to natural selection, due to mutations that are selected over others, and gene frequencies changing. And that might result in reproductive isolation, no longer being able to mate with the original population they were a part of. So if you kind of put this together with the cladograms we've been talking about, this kind of gives a visual that makes it maybe a little bit easier to understand this. So for example, if I were to map where the places are on this cladogram where macroevolution happened, right? I would choose the nodes, the places where species diverged. These are all places where one population became a new species and diverged from the other. All of the intersections are where macroevolution has happened. Right, so this is where macroevolution occurs. Macroevolution are the divergences. Right. And where I would place, put that down a little bit. There. So where I would place geographic isolation, okay, thank you. I think you need this actually. You should take that. Okay. Geographic isolation is what generally causes that. So geographic isolation goes here in the intersection, which is usually the impetus for speciation. And the reason why two populations are able to become different from each other is because they got isolated first and got exposed to different selection pressures. Then macroevolution is all of what happens on the straight line, right? Any little changes that happens on the straight line, but that doesn't, micro. Microevolution is what the straight lines represent, right? So all of this traveling along but not changing enough to speciate, all of that, that's all microevolution. Where little changes might happen, you might have the population grow slightly longer necks, but that doesn't change their species. Or maybe they'll have different colored feathers, but that won't change their species. It's only when it messes with the two populations' ability to reproduce with each other that it's called speciation. Okay, so hopefully that helps a little bit in terms of understanding the difference between evolution that happens in a big way and evolution that happens in a little way. Right. Okay, so that's macro versus microevolution, and I hope that was helpful.